We know how much you love talking about player feedback, and we do too. What's up, everybody? This is Let's Talk Customer Feedback, and I'm your host, Natalie. Thanks for listening, and thanks for telling your Player Insights Pro friends about us. This is Season 3, so let's get right into it. The gaming industry expects another booming year in both excitement and sales. But with the launch of many new games comes the realization that the market becomes even more crowded and the bar is raised yet again in all aspects, including games' complexity levels, design, story, and character features. So, can leveraging player feedback help with this? Let's find out with today's special guest. The influence of player feedback in indie games. Hello and welcome to a new episode of Let's Talk Customer Feedback. Today we have the pleasure of hosting Ian Cofino, co-founder at Afterburner Studios. Afterburner Studios, sorry about that. First, let's say hi to Ian. How are you doing today?
Hi, Natalie. Thanks for having me on.
We're very happy to have you here. And before we dive into the main topic today, we would like to hear about you. Can you tell us how you got into the industry and what do you do today?
Sure. Yeah. I co-founded a studio in 2018 with a few other friends. So we've been doing that for 4 years. We made a game called Dreamscaper, which I'm sure we'll talk about. Previously, I had kind of bounced around between a bunch of different creative fields. I have a background in more traditional art, fine art, graphic design, and I moved out to LA and then San Francisco, where I worked at my first foray into games was at Visual Concepts, working on NBA 2K. I was doing UI and UX stuff there. Then I moved over to a company called Outpost Games, where I worked for a few years and where I met my co-founders, and we worked on kind of a social survival battle royale title and a platform.
Oh, nice.
So just kind of a bunch of different things before I finally started this company and took on some other roles as well.
That's so interesting. And before we start with the more serious questions, can you tell us what's your favorite game of all times before we start?
Favorite game of all time? That's a tough question. It's probably going to be like the hardest question of the whole podcast. I'm a huge fan of the new God of War. Really love it. So I'm very excited for the new one that's coming out. But yeah, I play a lot of like Western RPGs, CRPGs, so things like Baldur's Gate and Pathfinder, Pillars of Eternity. I play a lot of fighting games and card games like Slay the Spire, roguelikes. So I'm a little bit all over the place.
Yeah, I can see that, but that's fun. We always want to get to know a bit better our guests. So thank you for that. And before we start, we would like to tell all a short story.
Welcome to Tales from the Feedback Grid. Amusing, exquisite, and horrific feedback stories gone, well, wrong. A year after the global Pokemon Go phenomenon in 2017, Niantic decided to bring together 20,000 Pokemon Go trainers from around the world. Held in Chicago, the plan was for a day of events, games, and community building, culminating in a challenge to unlock a legendary Pokemon. The ticket prices were as high as $2,000 due to the hype among hardcore fans. Well, you guessed it, of course this date went wrong. Doesn't it always happen? Game crashes, connectivity issues, and an angry crowd making themselves heard in front of Niantic CEO John Hanke all made Pokemon Go Fest a disaster. The Pokemon Go community couldn't be more vocal about their situation on the day. They had experienced technical issues beginning from 6 a.m., which was 4 hours earlier than when the event was going to start. As it doesn't sound good, huh? Bad day for Pokemon Go, I guess. Good day for Tales of the Feedback Grid. Thank you for listening. See you next week.
And with that story in mind, we can't wait to hear Ian's insights. So let's start. Can you introduce us a bit to your role in the company and what does Afterburner Studios do? And who did you co-found the company that you just mentioned, the friend you met before, but we would like to hear a bit more about it.
Yeah, sure. So in the summer of 2018, the three of us had left our previous company. And this is Rob Taylor and Paul Svoboda. Rob handles all of the engineering for the project, which is a huge undertaking, and Paul handles all the art, which is another equally huge undertaking. So he'll do things like characters, environment, props.
Right.
And for me, I kind of pick up some of the pieces in between. So with my background, I'm able to jump on a few different things. So design, animation, VFX, UI and UX, and then I split marketing and business responsibilities with Rob.
Well, that's awesome. You do kind of like a bit more, and we do have a question about that next. So before we dive into that, we know you released Dreamscaper back in August 2021. Can you tell us more about the game and its success?
Yeah, so Dreamscaper is an action roguelike with a waking dreaming gameplay cycle. So if you've ever played Hades, it's very kind of a similar structure to it. So during the night, you play as this young woman, Cassidy, who's recently moved from her old hometown to this new town to try to escape some of her demons in her past. And that's been catching up to her in her dreams. So you're battling through her nightmares and her dreams and trying to sort through what's happening with her during the day as you're meeting people and exploring this new city that she's just moved to. So it has that waking dreaming gameplay cycle, which is similar to, kind of the run focused and story focused elements of Hades.
I love that the main character is a woman. And so, as you mentioned before, you are responsible for a lot in the company. You do design, animation, VFX, UI, UX, along with other responsibilities of marketing and business development. Can you tell us how all of these roles intertwine in the company?
Yeah, I think it's just been a kind of a product of what are the things I've done in the past and how they've kind of interlinked as well, where I've had some experience with fine art, but I've also had some experience with more traditional design and video editing and I've, filmmaking, things like that. So that has helped a lot with this project so that, for instance, if I have an idea for something, I can see it through to execution in a lot of ways. Rob will create some tools and let's say there's a new item that I wanted to implement into the game. I could set up the animations for it. I could set up the VFX for it. I could structure it within the project we work in Unreal and get all of that working. And really that allows me to have the most control over what the vision is to what the output of that vision is. And that's really important. And then, of course, for marketing and business, it also helps that I have some background that's more in the art space, because then I can do things like cut together our trailers or create marketing assets and use some of that design background and getting feedback
Definitely.
on what things are working and what things aren't working. So there's a lot of overlap between those disciplines.
That actually sounds very fun. That you don't have just one role. It is a really good mix.
Yeah, I think I'd be. It's challenging when I'm at a company that I'm doing just one thing, because I like to be able to kind of bounce around. I think it keeps my my mind a little bit more engaged.
I can totally connect to that. And how do player feedback and player sentiment influence your day-to-day position?
So a little background on Dreamscaper to answer that, because it's when we started around maybe 3 months into the project, very, very early on, because we had no following. People knew of us in passing, but we didn't have a following as a studio. So we maybe 3 months into the project, kind of announced the game and then put it on, created Twitter and started trying to put it out there to get some movement behind it. And over the course of many, many iterative releases, we eventually grew that community. So we did things like a pre-alpha with just friends and family to solicit feedback. Then we did an alpha that was public, that people could join our Discord and get a key. And we did a Kickstarter demo, and then a beta, and then an early access launch in August of 2020. And each step of the way, we were soliciting feedback. We were soliciting feedback throughout that whole process as well. So really, the game was almost in like open development 9 months in, where the whole way as we were creating things, we were going through kind of a feedback pipeline. We were getting input from an audience.
Right, it makes it much more agile that you can like make changes on the go. It makes total sense.
Mm-hmm.
And as a professional in the games industry for such a long time, do you feel that companies put the players' voices at the center of the organization?
I think it depends on the company. Obviously for us, it was really important. And I think for a lot of, larger AAA studios, you'll see a mixture. So you'll see some that they have very strong UX divisions and player experience is really important for them. For other ones, they might be a little bit more traditional in how they approach things, where they kind of put out a box product, wait to get feedback, and then implement that feedback in the next product rather than kind of doing it through the actual cycle of development. But I think that's changing. I think a lot of companies are seeing the value in soliciting player feedback and doing consistent testing throughout the life cycle.
Right. Yeah, we can see also this trend lately, and I agree. And I think that at the end of the day, any company, it is super important because they are the customers, they are the players. So if you don't listen to what they feel and want, then probably they won't end up retaining those players, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also, it's one of those things where gaming is different than a lot of other fields because it has so much user interactivity. So separate from something like movies or books, television, there's so much more back and forth that's required between the audience and the creator when you're making a product,
Definitely.
especially thinking about it as a business. So it's really important that audience feedback is taken into account as you're developing.
Definitely. And you were telling us all the pre-launch feedback gathering that you had. And we've heard that it's very hard for indie games to gather feedback because, for instance, with big game studios that we work with, they have all of these huge communities in Discord, Reddit, Twitter, and it's very easy for them to find this feedback and to kind of like analyze it. So can you tell us a bit of how you gather and analyze your player feedback? And once you gather these insights, how does the company utilize this feedback to optimize the games?
Yeah, a bunch of good questions in there. Let's see if I can break them down one by one, because there's a couple things I want to talk about. One is that I do think it's a big problem, and you highlighted it, is finding people to give you feedback. For a lot of indie studios, that's very challenging. And we made a point of marketing very early on so that we could grow that community, and we used them in tandem. So growing the community to us also meant soliciting feedback. So it wasn't just getting more exposure for the game, but it also meant getting more feedback. So that it was kind of like a flywheel in that sense, where we would create marketing beats. So things like that alpha, where we went to Alpha Beta Gamer and we found ways to drive people to a Discord to create a community so that they could give feedback, so that could help market the game, to doing a Kickstarter, where the Kickstarter, while it was great to have the revenue that came from the Kickstarter, our primary motivation was to try to get exposure for people to learn more about our studio and our game, and get that momentum behind it. So having those milestones allowed us to create marketing beats that we could push the game out into the world. And then that started that kind of flywheel of getting people who were coming in, giving us feedback, learning about the game, telling other people, and then that was slowly kind of growing over time. So I think, for any indie that is struggling to find people, it's a hard problem. It really is. It's basically the problem of exposure, which is everyone's trying to solve that problem. How do I get more people to take a look at the thing I'm making? But trying to break it down into manageable steps will help, and being consistent with putting things out and responding and growing your community will also help. And then I think the other question was, how do we deal with feedback? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, so we don't have an incredibly formalized process just because we're such a small studio. It's the three of us, and our community hasn't grown so large that it's unmanageable. It has been challenging from time to time, but basically what we'll do is we'll kind of every day, especially after large milestones where there's a lot of people coming in and giving us feedback, we will go through, one of us, usually either me or Rob, will go through and kind of catalog all the feedback. So we'll have a spreadsheet that has all the feedback, and then as a team, we will go through that feedback and say, okay, what types of things have value to us? What types of things make sense for this, for us to work on, and prioritize all of that. So we have the sentiment feedback, And early on, we did some data analysis, but we found it was just kind of cumbersome and unwielding for just how large our community was.
Right.
We found we were getting a lot of good information just strictly from player sentiment and subjective feedback rather than objective feedback.
Yeah, makes sense. And at the end of the day, especially with a small studio, I think the qualitative data gives you a lot more understanding rather than just numbers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then you can kind of discern things from those as well.
Yeah, and since you're telling me that you analyze kind of like this subjective feedback, how do you balance out the negative and positive feedback? How can you choose kind of like what are you gonna use in the game? How are you gonna change the game? How does it impact the game?
Yeah, that's always tough because for every 10 pieces of positive feedback, you get one negative feedback, and then that's like the thing that you're all of a sudden stuck on.
Yeah.
But we try our best to maybe divorce emotion a little bit from it and think rationally about what is this person really trying to say? Because a lot of time you'll receive feedback as a game developer that might run counter to what your goals are, what your intentions are for the artistic intention of the game or the mechanics, how you want players to experience things. So it's always about a synthesis of where they're coming from, why they've given this feedback, and what your intentions are for the game. So there is feedback that is more valuable than other feedback. So that's a big part of it is looking through that feedback and saying this is in line with the kind of game that we want to make. It makes sense, and if it's not, really trying to drill down to see why they said this, not just what the solution that they're proposing is or what they think is the issue, but where they're coming from. And once you can understand that, then maybe you can see a through line between many pieces of feedback. And it's like, oh, it's this thing that's really causing these issues. It has a knock-on effect. So we try our best to kind of break down feedback that we get so that it can be reinterpreted in a way that makes sense for us as a team to implement.
Definitely. That makes total sense. And for the last question, I know this is going to be a hard one also. If there would be a dream insight you could get from your players, what would it be?
So I was thinking about this because you're right, this is a challenging question. But one thing I think would be really useful, early on I said we had some data analysis stuff. And I think the biggest thing that it gave to us was an understanding of our funnel. And for people who don't know, probably everyone who listens to this podcast would know, but the funnel meaning the drop-off points over time of your players, creating that kind of visually creating a funnel. So for us, as we were looking at that, we were saying, okay, after this tutorial, how many people drop off after the first level, after the first boss, into the second level, all these things, these drop-off points. And that is really useful because you're seeing that there is this funneling effect and you're seeing how much people are dropping off at each point, but something that players don't really tell you because they'll move on to something else. They'll be playing it and they'll play the first level and they'll say, you know what, this is not for me, or it doesn't grab them, and they'll just drop off and they won't give you any feedback. So you only have that objective feedback. So something that would be really useful and you have to really fish for is that qualitative feedback rather than the quantitative feedback of why it didn't click with them, or what wasn't working, or what could be done better to improve that player experience so the funnel widens. And that's something you kind of have to intuit, but it's very hard to get direct feedback on that specifically.
That's actually so interesting. I think that all companies would probably want to get this insight from their players. And I agree. And I think the public will definitely love that answer. And hopefully we can get a way to do it soon, because I think that everybody needs it.
Mm-hmm.
But Ian, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to participate in today's podcast and for sharing your insights on player feedback and the influence of it on indie games.
Great. Thank you, Natalie. I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you very much. And that's it for today. Let's Talk Customer Feedback is a podcast made for player insights professionals, player feedback enthusiasts, gaming industry experts, and anything in between. The podcast is created by Afogata, the AI-driven player feedback analytics platform that cuts through the noise and brings you the player insights that move the needle. In each episode, we have a special guest from the industry, including Afogata's own customers that share their knowledge on what player feedback and the voice of the customer means for them and the companies they work at. Follow Let's Talk Customer Feedback on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. If you'd like to know more about Afogata and what it does, go to afogata.com and get more info on our social media, searching for Afogata on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. See you next time. Don't keep your players waiting.